Hello and welcome. I'm going to tell you something that might sting a little, but it's the truth. Stuff. And if you're 60 or 70, you know exactly what I mean. We've spent decades collecting not just china, furniture, and memorabilia, but something far heavier, emotional burdens that weigh down our hearts and minds. Here's the honest truth. No one else cares about our physical possessions, but those invisible burdens? They're stealing our peace daily. The need for approval, toxic relationships, fear of death, stagnation. We've carried these weights for far too long. What if I told you that at this stage of life, you've earned the right to set these burdens down, to finally experience the lightness of living without them? Before we dive in, I'd love to know which city you're watching from. Drop it in the comments below, and if you want more wisdom for your golden years, hit that subscribe button. Now, let's start with the burden that kept me chained for decades, the exhausting need for approval. 1. The need for approval. The first burden I want to talk about might be the heaviest one many of us have carried since childhood, our desperate need for approval from others. Think about it. How many decisions in your life were made not because you wanted something, but because you worried what others might think? For some of us, it's been the driving force behind our choices for 6 or 7 decades. I remember when I was in my 30s, exhausting myself trying to host the perfect dinner parties. I'd spend weeks planning, days cooking, and hours arranging everything just so. I wasn't doing it because I enjoyed it. I was doing it because I wanted my guests to think I was accomplished, sophisticated, worthy of their admiration. I'd lie awake afterward, replaying conversations, worrying about whether someone's brief frown meant they didn't enjoy themselves. It was exhausting. This need for external validation doesn't just drain our energy, it steals our authenticity. When we're constantly looking outside ourselves for approval, we lose touch with what we truly want. We wear clothes that aren't comfortable because they're appropriate. We join clubs we don't enjoy because they're prestigious. We silence our true opinions because they might not be popular. And all the while, a quiet anxiety hums beneath everything we do. Am I good enough? Do they like me? Am I saying the right things? But here's the beautiful secret about growing older. We've earned the right to stop seeking approval. After 60+ years on this planet, we've paid our dues. We've raised families, built careers, weathered storms. We've proven ourselves 1,000 times over. And now, in these golden years, we can finally reclaim the freedom we had as children. The freedom to be unapologetically ourselves. I noticed this shift in my late 60s. Gradually, I started caring less about impressing others and more about what genuinely brought me joy. I began wearing comfortable shoes instead of fashionable ones. I started expressing my opinions more freely. I declined invitations to events I didn't want to attend without inventing excuses. And you know what happened? The world didn't end. In fact, my relationships deepened because people were finally meeting the real me. How can you recognize when you're still seeking external validation? Pay attention to that knot in your stomach when you're about to express an opinion. Notice when you're dressing for others' eyes rather than your own comfort. Catch yourself saying yes when you want to say no. These are all signs that you're still carrying this burden. Here's a simple exercise I practice. When making a decision, I ask myself, if no one else ever knew about this choice, what would I do? This strips away the performance aspect and connects you with your true desires. Try it. It's remarkably liberating. Another practice is what I call the daily appreciation. Each morning, look in the mirror and acknowledge one thing you like about yourself that has nothing to do with others' opinions. Maybe it's your sense of humor, your resilience, or your kindness. This builds the habit of self-approval. My friend Eleanor provides the perfect example of what happens when you release this burden. At 72, after decades of being the perfect hostess, committee member, and people pleaser, she decided to stop seeking approval. She resigned from clubs she didn't enjoy, started painting, something she'd always wanted to try, and began speaking her mind more freely. Some acquaintances fell away, but her true friends drew closer. "I feel like I'm finally living my own life," she told me, "not the one others expected of me." Today, at 78, Eleanor is more vibrant and content than I've ever seen her. Remember, at our age, we don't have time to waste living for others' approval. The most precious gift of these years is the freedom to finally, fully be ourselves. Isn't it time you unwrap that gift? 2. Releasing toxic relationships. The second burden that many of us have carried for far too long is toxic relationships. You know the ones I'm talking about, those connections that leave you feeling drained, anxious, or simply not good enough. At our age, we've collected many relationships, family, friends, acquaintances. But not all of them deserve to accompany us through these precious years ahead. In my own life, I struggled with a friendship that spanned over 4 decades. Richard had been my friend since college, but as the years passed, our relationship became increasingly one-sided. Every conversation revolved around his problems, his opinions, his needs. Whenever I shared a success, he would subtly diminish it. If I mentioned a challenge, he would explain how his challenges were far greater. I would end our coffee meetings feeling exhausted and somehow diminished, yet I continued these meetings out of loyalty and history. This is just how he is, I told myself. We've been friends for 40 years. I can't just walk away. What I didn't realize was the profound toll these interactions were taking on my health and happiness. Research shows that toxic relationships don't just hurt emotionally. They create measurable physical harm. They raise blood pressure, weaken immune function, and increase stress hormones. Some studies suggest that negative relationships can be more damaging to health than smoking or obesity. Think about that. The difficult person who regularly upsets you might be more harmful to your well-being than a cigarette habit. Here's what I've come to understand. At this stage of life, we have earned the wisdom to recognize what and who truly matters. We've lived long enough to know that time is precious, and we don't have endless years ahead to waste on relationships that diminish rather than enhance our lives. Our age gives us not just the wisdom to recognize toxic dynamics, but the permission to establish boundaries or, when necessary, to walk away entirely. I remember the day I finally decided to distance myself from Richard. It wasn't dramatic. I simply stopped initiating contact and began declining most of his invitations. When we did meet, I kept our visits brief. Was it uncomfortable? Initially, yes. Did I feel guilty? Absolutely. But that discomfort was temporary, while the relief I felt was profound and lasting. How can you identify which relationships in your life might be toxic rather than merely challenging? Pay attention to how you feel before, during, and after interactions. Do you dread seeing certain people? Do you feel you must walk on eggshells around them? Do you leave encounters feeling drained rather than energized? Do they consistently criticize, manipulate, or dismiss you? These are all warning signs. Creating boundaries doesn't require confrontation or explanation. You can simply become less available. Reduce the frequency and duration of interactions. Decline invitations that you know will lead to distress. Screen your calls when needed. Remember that no is a complete sentence. You don't need to justify your choices or provide elaborate excuses. One particularly effective technique is what I call energy mapping. Take a sheet of paper and list the people you interact with regularly. Next to each name, note how you feel after spending time with them. Energized, neutral, or depleted. Try to maximize time with the energizers and minimize time with the depleters. This simple exercise can transform your social calendar and, consequently, your quality of life. My neighbor Martha provides a powerful example of the freedom that comes from releasing toxic relationships. For years, she maintained strained relationships with her sister-in-law, who constantly belittled her and created drama at family gatherings. After her husband passed, Martha made the difficult decision to significantly limit contact. She explained to other family members that she wished everyone well, but would be attending fewer events where her sister-in-law would be present. The result? At 75, Martha says she feels like a different person. Her anxiety has diminished. She sleeps better. The energy she previously spent managing that difficult relationship now goes into her watercolor painting, her grandchildren, and friendships that bring her genuine joy. "I just wish I hadn't waited so long," she told me recently. "I didn't realize how heavy that burden was until I set it down." Isn't it time for you to consider which relationships you might need to adjust or release? Remember, creating boundaries isn't selfish. It's a form of self-care. And at this stage of life, you've earned the right to prioritize your peace. 3. Embracing mortality. Now I want to address something that often remains unspoken, yet grows more present in our minds with each passing birthday: our awareness of mortality. It's that quiet whisper that reminds us the window is closing, that our time here is limited. For many of us, this awareness can transform from a background thought into a preoccupying fear that casts a shadow over our days. I remember the exact moment when my own mortality became real to me. It wasn't during a health scare or a near-miss accident. It was at my 65th birthday party, surrounded by my family. My grandson asked innocently how old people can get, and in that moment, something shifted inside me. I realized I had likely lived more years than I had left. For weeks afterward, I found myself waking at night with a tightness in my chest, calculating how many years I might have remaining, and worrying about all the things I hadn't yet done or said. This fear of death, when we allow it to take hold, becomes one of the heaviest burdens we can carry. The cruel irony is that by fixating on the end of life, we rob ourselves of fully experiencing life now. We hesitate to make plans, thinking, "I might not be here." We postpone joy, thinking, "What's the point?" We exist in a state of anxious waiting rather than present living. And in doing so, we lose the very thing we fear losing: life itself. But there's another way to carry our awareness of mortality, not as a fearful burden, but as a clarifying gift. When we truly accept the finite nature of our time, something remarkable happens. The unimportant falls away. Petty concerns diminish. We become more intentional about how we spend our days and with whom we spend them. Colors seem brighter, conversations more meaningful, simple pleasures more delicious. I found my own shift happening gradually. I began to ask myself each morning, if this day were one of my last, would I spend it worrying about things I cannot change? Would I waste it on regrets about the past or anxiety about the future? The answer was always no. Slowly, my relationship with mortality transformed from fear to grateful awareness. One practice that has helped me immensely is what I call the sunset moment. Each evening, I take 5 minutes to watch the changing light. During this time, I focus completely on my senses, the colors in the sky, the feeling of air on my skin, the distant sounds of the world settling down. This simple mindfulness practice anchors me firmly in the present moment, which is, after all, the only moment we ever truly have. Another approach is to consider your legacy not as something you leave after you're gone, but as something you create daily through your actions. When I call my granddaughter, just tell her I'm thinking of her, that's legacy. When I write down family stories to share with younger generations, that's legacy. When I volunteer at the community garden, that's legacy. These actions create meaning and connection now, while enriching the lives of others beyond our time. Finding peace with mortality often comes through connecting with the natural cycles of life. I've found comfort in gardening, witnessing the seasons, the necessary dormancy of winter, the rebirth of spring. There's wisdom in nature's patterns that helps me understand my own place in the ongoing cycle of life. My friend William offers a beautiful example of how embracing mortality can transform life's quality. At 73, he received a diagnosis that severely limited his life expectancy. Rather than retreating into fear, William made a conscious decision to live his remaining time with extraordinary presence. He reconnected with estranged friends, forgave old hurts, and spent hours simply sitting in his garden, fully absorbed in the beauty around him. When I visited him about a month before he passed, he told me something I'll never forget. "I've never been more alive than I am right now." His face was serene, his eyes clear. "I don't fear death anymore," he said, "because I'm not waiting to start living." William taught me that accepting mortality doesn't diminish life, it heightens it. In his final months, he experienced more genuine joy and connection than many people find in decades of anxious avoidance. Can you imagine the freedom of releasing the fear that constricts so many of our days? What might change if you carried your awareness of mortality not as a burden, but as an invitation to live more fully right now? After all, it's not about counting the days, but making the days count. Avoiding stagnation. The final burden I want to address today might be the most dangerous of all: stagnation. It creeps in so quietly that many don't notice until it has settled deeply into their lives. It's that subtle shift from living to merely existing, from growing to simply aging. It's the unspoken assumption that our time for learning, for passion, for meaningful contribution has somehow passed. I confronted this in my own life shortly after retirement. After decades of structured days and clear purpose, I found myself adrift. My calendar, once filled with meetings and deadlines, suddenly gaped with empty days. At first, I embraced the rest. Goodness knows I'd earned it. But as weeks stretched into months, I noticed something troubling. My mind felt less sharp, my body grew stiffer. Even my curiosity, something that had always defined me, began to dull. I caught myself saying things like, "That's for younger folks," or "I'm too old to start something new." I was settling into that proverbial rocking chair, watching life rather than participating in it. This stagnation isn't just a mental burden, it manifests physically. Studies show that when we stop challenging ourselves and learning new things, our cognitive abilities decline faster. When we reduce physical movement, our muscles atrophy more quickly. The old saying, "Use it or lose it," proves devastatingly true as we age. Even more concerning, this stagnation often leads to isolation and depression, creating a downward spiral that can dramatically reduce not just quality of life, but life expectancy itself. But here's the beautiful truth about this stage of life. We have freedoms now that we've never had before. Most of us have fewer responsibilities, more accumulated wisdom, and the precious gift of time. Without the pressures of building careers or raising families, we can explore interests purely for the joy of discovery. We can try new things without the burden of having to master them or build them into careers. This is not the end of growth, it's potentially the richest soil for it. When I recognized my slide toward stagnation, I made a commitment to myself. Each month, I would try something entirely new. It didn't need to be grand, just different. I took a watercolor class and was terrible at it, but laughed more than I had in years. I joined a local history group exploring forgotten stories of our town. I started taking different routes on my daily walks, discovering corners of my neighborhood I'd never noticed in 20 years of living here. One of the simplest ways to fight physical stagnation is through deliberate, consistent movement. I'm not talking about marathon training, I'm talking about making movement a natural part of your day. I use what I call the commercial break challenge. During every TV commercial, I get up and move. Sometimes it's simply walking to the kitchen for water. Other times it's gentle stretching or marching in place. I have a reminder on my phone that chimes every hour, prompting me to stand and move for just 2 minutes. These small movements maintain flexibility and circulation without requiring special equipment or significant time. For mental stagnation, the antidote is curiosity. I've made it a habit to learn one new fact each day. Sometimes I research questions I've always wondered about. Other times, I ask people about their areas of expertise. You'd be amazed what you can learn from a casual conversation with your pharmacist or the person behind you in the coffee line. Reading outside your usual interests can also spark new neural connections. If you typically read history, try a mystery novel. If you follow politics, read about astronomy. Perhaps most important is finding purpose, something that gets you out of bed with anticipation rather than obligation. This doesn't need to be grand or world-changing. My neighbor finds his purpose in mentoring young entrepreneurs one afternoon a week. My sister-in-law finds hers in the community garden she helps maintain. For me, it's the oral history project I started, recording the stories of longtime residents before those memories are lost. My friend Evelyn provides a stunning example of living without stagnation. At 84, she decided to learn to play the cello, something she'd always wanted to do but never had time for during her career as a nurse. When people asked why she would start something so challenging at her age, she replied, "If not now, when?" Today, at 92, she plays in a community orchestra and teaches music appreciation to other seniors. Her mind remains sharp, her fingers nimble, and her calendar full. The secret, she told me, is to never stop being a beginner at something. What might you begin today? What curiosity have you left unexplored? What movement have you been postponing? Remember, stagnation is not an inevitable part of aging. It's a burden we can choose to set down. And when we do, we often find that our late years can be among our most vibrant, most creative, and most joyful. So, what's in your bag of burdens? The need for approval that never truly satisfied? Toxic relationships draining your energy? The fear of mortality stealing your present joy? Or the stagnation that dims your natural brilliance? These weights weren't meant to accompany you through these precious years. When we release these 4 burdens, we discover something remarkable. These later years can become our most peaceful, most authentic, most fulfilled. This is your time to live unburdened. I'd love to hear which burden resonates most with you. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your insight might be exactly what someone else needs to hear. Remember, even if you're physically alone, you're part of this community. You are truly loved. I look forward to our next conversation, and until then, be good to yourself. You've earned it.